Welcome back, everybody. Alex Wiseman still here, still talking to you about Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited. We have just taken a little tour in the first part of the screencast of the things that you're doing this week while we're online only. And we also talked about some of the conceptual and theoretical frameworks that we were working through in terms of thinking about globalization and contextualization as it relates to our really interesting look at preschools in Japan and previously China and next week the United States. So here we go. So we can start with some basic questions that I don't think we've asked yet, but let's try to be clear about what we're talking about here. First of all, what is preschool and what is the purpose of preschool? So preschool is typically formal education of some sort, whether it be curriculum based or an academically oriented or more childcare based and play oriented. But it typically takes place before the first formal year of primary school. Okay, so it could be a range of ages, anywhere from birth to probably around 6 years old in most countries. Now, in their original book, Preschool and Three Cultures, Tobin, Wu, and Davidson, he had two different co-authors then, made this argument for the purpose of preschool. They said that with growing numbers of mothers in the workforce, industrialized societies are turning increasingly to preschools to educate, nurture, and socialize young children. So we've got a reason why preschools exist. Now, I don't disagree with this at all. In fact, I think that that is a rational approach to it. Growing numbers of mothers in the workforce, traditional family care members, which would be often mothers in many cultures worldwide, certainly in some of the cultures that are represented in the book, are working outside of the home for lengths of periods during the day that they normally would not have or previously would not have. That's better than normally. Which means that there's no one to care for the child during the day, assuming that the father is also working outside of the home. And assuming that we're talking about a mother-father family unit. All right, so there are lots of assumptions that are going along with this, but let's just say more people that would traditionally have cared for the child during the early years of its life are now working outside of the home, regardless of whether they're mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, friends, cousins, who knows. The other thing is that they note that industrialized societies are turning increasingly to preschools. Now, it's interesting that they say that, because they're suggesting that the more industrialized, the more developed a country is, the more likely it is that traditional child caregivers will be working outside of the home. Right? And so pre-industrial or agricultural or other kinds of societies may not be turning to preschools because there is not the same sort of work available outside of the home. That's interesting, right? Next, they say they're turning to preschools to educate, nurture, and socialize young children. Now, that is where I think it gets super interesting. So what does a preschool do? Right? Well, it educates. It teaches basic academics, pre-literacy, pre-numeracy, or literacy and numeracy if you want to get hardcore. It teaches about concepts, relationships, and I'm talking about intellectually understanding these things right now. Right? That's all part of what happens in preschools. The nurturing part, the recognition that children at this age need some sort of particular care. Right? They need to be nurtured. It's not just we're going to watch you for 8 hours during the day while your family members are working. It's a more intimate relationship than that, and it suggests that there's a recognition that child development at the preschool age is particularly connected to developing relationships. Right? That's interesting. And then finally, socializing young children. which for me is perhaps the most interesting part of this, because it talks about it, or it implies that preschools are embedding particular expectations, particular cultural understanding, particular relationship mores or rules, right, into young children. They're learning how to be around other people, and they're learning what that means, and they're learning how they interact and what they can get away with, and they're learning a little bit of what's right and what's wrong. Right? There's a lot going on in preschool. Now the question is, before we move on, does this end when the children graduate from preschool to primary school, and then from primary school to secondary school, and on and on? Does the sort of core mission of school to educate, nurture, and socialize disappear? And I would argue that it does not. I would argue that it shifts, that it adjusts, that the way that we educate, nurture, and socialize preschool age children will be different than primary age or secondary age students. But that those three core components of schooling still exist. Now that's going to be important, especially if we're thinking about globalization and contextualization. So what do preschools produce? Well, Carol Kemmerer in the Los Angeles Times a while ago, I don't have a date on this, but it's older, suggests that preschools may be at the front line of conserving social structures and values. And the reason for that is that preschools, like primary schools as well, have in many ways taken the place of parents' roles in terms of creating social structures and values in youth, because it is the place where they spend most of their waking hour. They have the most interaction. They have the often direct instruction in social structures and values, and that is carried over throughout the rest of their lives, that what is embedded in their brains and that they experience in preschool is going to shape the rest of their educational experience, because education is cumulative, meaning that it adds, every year adds to the previous experience, the previous knowledge, the previous whatever. So if preschools are at the front line of conserving social structures and values, then that suggests that the very beginning of that cumulative process, there is an emphasis on the context, on the local culture, on the traditional values, right? That's that conserving part. It's not talking about progressiveness. It's not talking about getting crazy and doing things that are trying out values and social structures that have never been tried before. No, quite the opposite. It's about emphasizing what is known, what is traditionally legitimized, and what is unique to that community and its context. Okay. So in 1989, Tobin Wu and Davidson said that some typical expectations of preschools could be represented this way. They said, "We view preschools as complex institutions serving children, parents, and indirectly the wider society," although I would argue that it's more directly. "Embedded in communities, nations, and cultures, preschools both reflect and affect social change." So embedded in communities, nations, and cultures. How is a preschool embedded? How is it embedded in a community, a nation, and a culture? Okay, well, communities maybe we can get, because there are preschools in many neighborhoods, right? We could consider those communities. Often those preschools in those neighborhoods have a particular culture that surrounds them. So for example, it could be a culture based on socioeconomic status. Maybe it's an elite community, or maybe it's a poor community, or maybe it's a middle-class community, or some other kind of community. Or those communities could be characterized by particular racial or ethnic groups. Maybe it's a predominantly white community, like Bethlehem, well, parts of Bethlehem. Maybe it's a predominantly Hispanic community, or a predominantly African or African American community if we're in the United States, or some other ethnic or racial group. Or maybe it's a community that speaks a particular language. All right, you get the point. What I find, I guess, a little harder to just sort of explain away is not really, to explain, is how preschools are embedded in nations and cultures. And the reason why is that there is, in most formal education systems, a particular national curriculum or national set of standards for primary and secondary schools. There is much less often a particular set of standards and expectations for preschools. Now, we just talked in the previous screencast about a national organization that in the United States that has international influence. And so we could make the argument that there are transnational actors at work here. But how are nations at work here? What is national about preschools? How are the preschools that are represented in Preschool in Three Cultures and Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited nationally representative? Because Tobin and his colleagues argue, I think repeatedly, that they aren't. That just one preschool is not going to represent all of the types of preschool education that occurs in any of these countries, which is one of the reasons why they added additional preschools in Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited. Next is cultures. Now, culture is a little more difficult to define, although we did have, just in the last screencast, this idea that there might be, and let me go back to it so that we're all, oops, too far, right here, that there is a world-level cultural account and educational ideology which provides some sort of ideological legitimation. And this is, again, what we're kind of trying to argue about, not in a way, but in a how do we discover what this means way, and how do we see where globalization and contextualization are either at odds or integrating in our preschool examples from Preschool in Three Cultures. All right, let me move back up to the slide. Here we are. Okay. So as a result, preschools both reflect and affect social change, meaning that the preschool, according to Tobin and his colleagues, is sort of the bellwether. It's the signal or symbol of social, cultural, ideological change. All right. Well, with that in mind, let's do a little bit of backtracking, and I just want to backtrack to last week. Because I think that there were a lot of good comments, by the way, from those of you who did post something on the discussion board. But there were a couple that I wanted to highlight because I thought they were interesting to discuss. And maybe what I should do now is pause, because we're almost at the end of our 15 minutes, and we'll come back in the third screencast to talk about some of the discussion board postings related to the chapter on China.